The first thing I saw when I turned the corner onto my street wasn't the familiar red brick of my apartment building, but a cloud of white feathers dancing in the wind like a macabre celebration. My grandmother's down pillows had been ripped open, and as I looked down at the gutter, I saw my favorite emerald silk slip, the one I'd bought specifically for our honeymoon, soaking in a puddle of muddy rainwater. My future mother-in-law, Elena, the same woman who had spent 2 years lecturing me on the sanctity of a woman's dignity and the purity of the soul, was currently leaning over my third-floor balcony, shouting to the neighbors that she was cleansing a house of sin. Beside her stood Mark, the man I was supposed to marry in 3 weeks, holding my heavy leather suitcases and methodically dropping them into the bushes below, as if he were taking out the morning trash. This was the same balcony where, only 3 months ago, Mark had knelt on one knee and promised me a lifetime of protection. Now, he wouldn't even look down to see if his protection was hitting me on the head. The sheer audacity of it felt like a physical blow to my chest, a sudden vacuum of air that left me gasping. They weren't just throwing away clothes, they were discarding the very foundation of my life, using a twisted sense of morality as a crowbar to pry me out of my own home. To understand how I ended up standing on a sidewalk covered in my own shredded history, you have to understand what that apartment meant to me. It wasn't just real estate, it was my fortress. My grandmother, a woman who had survived a revolution and 2 divorces, had left it to me with a single piece of advice. Never let a man hold the key to your peace of mind, Anya. I had spent 3 years meticulously restoring it. I remember the smell of the linseed oil I used on the original 1920s hardwood floors, the way the afternoon sun would hit the stained glass transom window and paint the hallway in shades of amber and violet. It was a place of quiet rituals, the whistle of the copper kettle at 7 a.m., the soft scratching of my pen as I worked on my architectural designs, the scent of expensive vanilla candles that lingered in the curtains. When Mark entered my life, he seemed to fit into that piece perfectly. He was an associate at a mid-sized law firm, always dressed in crisp blue shirts that smelled of cedar and starch. He was soft-spoken, seemingly supportive of my career, and he possessed a kind of calm that I found intoxicating. He moved in 8 months ago, and at first, it was a dream. We'd share coffee on that very balcony, talking about our future children and the life we'd build. He'd kiss my forehead every morning and tell me how lucky he was to have found a woman so independent and driven. But with Mark came Elena. From the moment I met her, Elena was a woman of principles. She carried herself with a stiff, unnatural posture, her hair always pulled back into a bun so tight it seemed to pull her eyes into a permanent squint of disapproval. She was a pillar of her local church, a woman who spoke in hushed, reverent tones about traditional values and the proper place for a wife. "It's a bit unconventional, isn't it, dear?" she had said during our first dinner in my dining room, her eyes roaming over my antique furniture as if she were looking for dust or hidden sins. A woman owning such a large property all by herself, it seems lonely. A house needs a master to truly be a home. I had laughed it off then, sipping my wine and reaching for Mark's hand. "Mark is the master of my heart, Elena, but the mortgage is all mine." Mark had chuckled, though looking back, his laughter sounded thin, like breaking glass. Over the next year, Elena's concerns became a constant background noise. She would drop by unannounced, bringing blessed candles to clear the energy of our living arrangement. She never failed to mention how sinful it was for us to share a bed before the priest had spoken his words. "Living together before marriage is a stain on your reputation, Anya," she would whisper while Mark was in the kitchen. "A man cannot respect a woman who gives him the milk for free before he buys the cow." I found the analogy disgusting, but I stayed polite for Mark's sake. He would always apologize for her later, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear and saying, "She's from a different time, honey. She just wants the best for us. Once we're married, she'll settle down." I believed him. I believed him when he said he loved the apartment. I believed him when he suggested we spend my savings on the perfect wedding instead of putting it into my retirement fund. I even believed him when he asked for a spare set of keys for his mother, just in case of an emergency. The cracks were there, of course, Small things. Elena started suggesting redecorating ideas, which really meant replacing my grandmother's heirlooms with heavy, dark furniture that looked like it belonged in a cathedral. Mark started complaining about the clutter of my drafting table, suggesting I move my office to a small rental space so we could have a proper guest room for his mother. "She's getting older, Anya," he'd say, his voice trailing off as he avoided my gaze. "She needs to know she has a place here." "She has a place for dinner on Sundays, Mark," I'd respond firmly. "But this is my home, my sanctuary." I didn't realize then that in their minds, my sanctuary was merely a prize to be conquered. To Elena, my independence wasn't a virtue, it was a challenge. And to Mark, it was an asset he hadn't quite figured out how to put his name on. The weeks leading up to the cleansing were strangely quiet. Elena had stopped her snide remarks. She even brought over a tray of her homemade honey cakes. Mark was more attentive than ever, though he seemed nervous, his hands shaking slightly when he poured our wine. I thought it was just pre-wedding jitters. I thought we were finally becoming the family I had hoped for. I was so wrong. That morning, I had left for a site visit 3 hours away, feeling energized and happy. I had kissed Mark goodbye, noting that he was already fully dressed and drinking coffee at 6 a.m., staring out the window with a blank expression. "You okay?" I had asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Yeah," he'd replied, his voice a dull monotone. "Just thinking about the future." I had smiled, thinking he meant our honeymoon. I didn't realize he meant a future that didn't include me, but definitely included my property. I didn't realize that as soon as my car cleared the driveway, he was opening the door for his mother and a group of movers she had hired from her congregation. As I stood on the sidewalk now, watching a crate of my porcelain dishes smash into the gravel, the quiet of the past few weeks finally made sense. It wasn't peace, it was a siege, and they had waited until I was far enough away to strike. "Elena!" I screamed, my voice cracking as I stepped over a pile of my ruined books. "Mark, what the hell are you doing?" Up on the balcony, Elena stopped. She smoothed her apron, her face contorted into a mask of righteous fury. "I am doing what should have been done months ago, Anna," she shouted down, her voice echoing off the neighboring buildings. "I am purging this den of iniquity. If you want to live like a harlot, you can do it on the street. A man of Mark's standing will not live in a house owned by a woman who doesn't respect the laws of God." I looked at Mark. He was holding my jewelry box, the one that held my grandmother's pearls. He looked down at me, and for a second, I saw a flicker of shame. But then, Elena whispered something in his ear, and his face hardened. He didn't say a word. He just tilted his hand, and I watched in slow motion as the box tumbled through the air, spilling gold and pearls into the dirt like discarded seeds. The sight of those pearls scattering in the mud broke something inside me. It wasn't just the jewelry. It was the history, the memories of my grandmother's gentle hands clasping that necklace around my throat on my graduation day. I didn't scream this time. A strange, icy clarity washed over me, the kind of calm that precedes a hurricane. I didn't care about the neighbors watching from their windows or the movers in black suits who looked more like hired thugs than churchgoers. I lunged for the front door of the building. One of the men tried to block the entrance, a burly man with a crucifix pinned to his lapel. "Sister Elena says the premises are being purified, miss. You aren't welcome. Get out of my way before I call the police and tell them you're trespassing and committing grand larceny," I hissed. My voice was low, vibrating with a rage so pure it seemed to physically push him back. He hesitated, seeing the fire in my eyes, and I shoved past him, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. As I took the stairs 2 at a time, my mind raced back to the warning signs I had stupidly ignored over the last month. 2 weeks ago, I had come home early to find Elena sitting at my dining table with a man I didn't recognize. They had a stack of papers between them, and the man was holding a professional-grade camera. "Oh, Anya," Elena had chirped, not looking flustered at all. "This is Mr. Petrov. He's an appraiser. For the insurance, you know. Now that you and Mark are merging your lives, we must ensure everything is properly valued." I had found it odd. Why would she handle my insurance? But Mark had stepped out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel, and said, It's for the best, honey. With the wedding coming up, I just want to make sure your assets are protected. My firm handles these things all the time. Then there was the night I couldn't find my spare set of keys, or the deed to the apartment, which I kept in a small fireproof safe in the study. Mark told me I'd probably just misplaced them in the chaos of wedding planning. You've been so stressed, Anya. Let me take care of the paperwork for a while. Rest your beautiful head. I had let him. I had actually thanked him for taking the burden off my shoulders. I felt a wave of nausea hit me as I reached the third-floor landing. I wasn't just a victim of a sudden whim. I was the target of a long, calculated campaign. The door to my apartment was propped open with a heavy boot. I burst inside and stopped dead. The smell hit me first. Not my vanilla candles, but the sharp, sterile sting of industrial ammonia and the cloying scent of cheap frankincense. Elena was standing in the center of my living room, clutching a spray bottle of holy water, spritzing the walls as if she were extinguishing a fire. "Out," I said, my voice trembling. "Get out of my house, now." Elena turned, her eyes wide with a performative pity that made my skin crawl. "It's not your house anymore, Anya. A house of God cannot belong to a woman who refuses to submit to the natural order. We are doing this for your soul, truly, and for Mark's future." "Mark!" I yelled, ignoring her. "Mark, get in here!" He walked out of our bedroom, his face pale, avoiding my eyes. He was carrying my laptop, the one that contained all my architectural blueprints and client contracts. "Mark, tell her to leave," I pleaded, my voice breaking for a second. "Tell these people to stop throwing my things onto the street. This is my apartment. My grandmother left it to me." Mark finally looked at me, but there was no love in his eyes, only a cold, bureaucratic detachment. "Technically, Anya, it's not yours, not anymore." The world slowed down, the ringing in my ears became a roar. "What are you talking about?" He walked over to the dining table and picked up a manila folder. With a hand that didn't even shake, he pulled out a document and slid it across the mahogany surface. I stepped forward, my legs feeling like lead, my breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. It was a deed of gift. My eyes blurred as I scanned the legalese. It stated that I, Anya Sokolov, was voluntarily transferring full ownership of the property to the St. Jude's Family Trust, a charitable foundation where, as it turned out, Elena was a founding board member. But it was the bottom of the page that stopped my heart. There, in neat black ink, was my signature, my distinctive slanted cursive with the little loop on the Y that I'd practiced since I was a teenager. I felt a sudden, violent surge of vertigo. I had to grab the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in on me. I had never seen this document in my life. I had never signed away my home. "I never signed this," I whispered, the words tasting like ash. "This is a forgery. You stole my signature from the wedding venue contracts." "Be careful with your accusations, dear," Elena said, stepping closer, the scent of ammonia now overpowering. "We have witnesses. Mr. Petrov, the notary, he saw you sign it. Mark saw you sign it. You were so happy to do it, remember? You said you wanted to start your marriage with a clean slate, free from the burden of earthly possessions." "You're lying," I choked out, looking at Mark. "Mark, tell me you didn't do this. You're a lawyer. You know this is a crime. This is prison time, Mark." Mark looked down at his shoes, his silence more deafening than Elena's screeching. He didn't defend me. He didn't deny it. He just stood there, a hollow shell of the man I thought I loved, while his mother took another step toward me, her face inches from mine. "You should leave now, Anya," she said, her voice a terrifyingly soft purr, "before we have to call the police on you for disturbing the peace in a private residence. We've already changed the locks on the back door. The front is next." My stomach gave a violent lurch. I thought I was going to be sick right there on the floor I had polished with my own hands. My pulse was thundering in my temples, a rhythmic drumbeat of betrayal. They hadn't just thrown my clothes out. They had stolen my past, my present, and my roof. And the man who had promised to cherish me was the one who had handed them the pen. The silence that followed Elena's threat was so heavy it felt like it was crushing the very air out of my lungs. I looked at Mark, waiting for him to wake up from this nightmare, waiting for him to grab my hand and tell me this was all some twisted joke his mother was playing. But he just stood there by the window, his silhouette framed by the late afternoon light, fiddling with his silver watch, the one I had given him for his birthday. He wouldn't even look at the floor, let alone at me. "Mark," I whispered, my voice sounding like it belonged to a stranger. Look at me and tell me you're really doing this. Tell me you're standing in my grandmother's house, watching your mother throw my life into the gutter, and you're okay with it." He finally shifted his weight, his eyes darting to me for a fraction of a second before skittering away like a roach from the light. "Anya, please, don't make this more difficult than it already is. My mother is right about one thing. We need a fresh start. And the apartment, it's a liability. My firm is looking at a partnership for me, but they value family stability. A man living in his wife's premarital property doesn't look stable. It looks temporary." I felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in my throat. "Temporary? You think stealing my home makes you look stable? You're a lawyer, Mark. You know this is fraud. You know that signature is a lie." "It's not a lie if you can't prove it," Elena interrupted, her voice sharp as a razor. She stepped between us, her presence a cold wall of polyester and self-righteousness. "And who would believe you? A woman who spends her days drawing pictures and her nights living in sin. Mark has the reputation. I have the community. You have, what? A pile of wet clothes in the street?" She smiled then, a slow, terrifying peeling back of her lips that showed too many teeth. "And besides, Anya, the apartment is already spoken for. The St. Jude's Trust has already signed a preliminary agreement to sell the unit to a private buyer. The funds are already being allocated to our New Beginnings program. You're practically a philanthropist now. You should be proud." The room began to spin. They weren't just stealing it, they had already sold it. The appraiser I saw 2 weeks ago wasn't for insurance, he was for the sale. Every "I love you" Mark had whispered in our bed for the last month had been a calculation, a way to keep me distracted while they scouted buyers for my life. "You sold it?" I gasped, my hand flying to my mouth. "It's not even yours to sell. The deed transfer hasn't even been processed by the city yet." "Oh, it has," Mark said, his voice regaining some of its legalistic coldness. "I filed the expedited paperwork 3 days ago while you were at that conference in the city. Since I had your notarized signature, it went through without a hitch. By tomorrow, the title will be clear in the trust's name." I felt a sharp, stabbing pain in my chest, a physical manifestation of my heart actually breaking. But then, a new thought hit me, cold and terrifying. "The wedding account," I whispered. "The $60,000 we saved for the ceremony and the honeymoon. Mark, tell me the money is still there." Elena let out a short, dry cackle. "The sin fund? That money was earned through the labor of a household that wasn't yet blessed. It has been redirected to the trust as an administrative fee for the property transfer. Consider it your tithe, Anya, a way to wash away the stain of these last 8 months." I turned to Mark, my eyes burning with tears I refused to let fall. "That was my inheritance, Mark. That was the money my father left me when he died. You promised we'd use it to start our life together. You said we were a team." Mark finally looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes wasn't guilt, it was resentment. "A team? You ran everything, Anya. Your apartment, your rules, your father's money. I was just a guest in your life. My mother showed me that. She showed me that as long as you held the purse strings, I would never be the head of this family. I'm just taking back the dignity you never gave me." "Dignity?" I spat the word out like it was poison. "You think there's dignity in being a thief? You think there's dignity in hiding behind your mother's skirts while you rob the woman you claim to love?" "That's enough," Elena shouted, stepping forward and pointing a trembling finger at the door. "You will not speak to my son that way. You are a guest here no longer. You are a trespasser. Leave now, or I will call the police and have you removed in handcuffs. I'm sure your clients would love to see their architect being hauled off for a mental breakdown." I looked from her twisted, triumphant face to Mark's cowardly, averted gaze. I looked at the walls I had painted, the floors I had waxed, and the man I had planned to grow old with. The physical shock was fading, replaced by something much more dangerous, a white-hot, crystalline rage. "You want me to leave?" I said, my voice suddenly calm, dropping an octave. "Fine, I'll leave." Elena smirked, adjusting her bun. "Wise choice, dear. There's a suitcase left in the hall. Take it and go." I walked toward the door, but as I passed the dining table, I stopped. I looked at Mark one last time. "You know, Mark, I used to think your mother was the problem. I thought she was just a bitter, controlling woman who couldn't let go. But I see now that she's just the mirror. You're the real monster, because you knew what love felt like, and you chose a condo over it." I leaned in closer, until I could smell the expensive cologne I had bought him lingering on his skin. "I'm going to give you one chance, Mark. One single chance to stop this. Give me the folder. Call the city. Tell them the deed is a forgery. If you do it now, I won't call the police. I'll let you walk away with your dignity intact." Mark looked at his mother. Elena didn't even blink. She just crossed her arms over her chest and stared me down. Mark turned back to me, his jaw tightening. "Leave, Anya," he said, his voice flat, "before I make you." That was it. The click happened. The woman who had been gasping for air on the sidewalk 10 minutes ago was gone. In her place was someone I didn't quite recognize, someone cold, calculating, and utterly finished with being a victim. "All right," I said, a small, terrifying smile touching my lips. "Have it your way. But remember this moment, Mark. Remember that I gave you a choice." I didn't take the suitcase in the hall. I didn't look at the movers who were now hovering in the doorway. I walked out of my apartment, down the stairs, and straight past my ruined belongings on the sidewalk. I didn't stop until I was inside my car. My hands were steady as I reached into my glove compartment and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. It was my backup project log, the one where I recorded every contractor meeting, every site visit, and every financial transaction related to the apartment's renovation. But there was something else tucked into the back pocket, a business card I'd kept for 3 years. It was for a man named Viktor Vlasov. He wasn't just a lawyer, he was a specialist in white-collar crime and property fraud. And more importantly, he was my grandmother's godson, a man who loathed Elena's charity almost as much as I did. I picked up my phone and dialed the number. My voice didn't shake. "Victor? It's Anya Sokolov. I need you to do 2 things. First, I need a temporary restraining order and an emergency freeze on the title for 124 Oak Street. And second, I need you to help me burn a charitable trust to the ground." The 3 days that followed were a blur of cold coffee, humming server drives, and the quiet, rhythmic scratching of Victor's pen. I didn't stay at a hotel. I stayed in a spare room at my lead contractor's house, surrounded by rolls of blueprints and the comforting smell of sawdust. I wasn't the grieving fiancé anymore. I was a project manager, and I was looking for the structural flaws in Elena and Mark's plan. "They were arrogant, Anya," Victor said, leaning back in his leather chair, the walls of his office lined with the heavy, law-bound volumes that Mark so desperately wanted to represent. "They thought because you were an artist, you wouldn't understand the mechanics of a title transfer, but they forgot one thing." "They forgot I'm an architect," I said, my voice steady. "I don't just draw pretty pictures, Victor. I build systems, and I document every single bolt and beam." I had something they didn't know about. 2 years ago, when I was renovating the apartment, I had installed a state-of-the-art, hidden security system. Not for burglars, but for insurance purposes for my grandmother's antiques. The cameras were recessed into the ornate crown molding, virtually invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for them. I hadn't checked the feed in months because I trusted Mark. But the cloud storage didn't care about trust. It only cared about data. On my laptop screen, we watched the footage from 3 days prior. there was Mark, sitting at my desk, practicing my signature on sheet after sheet of paper until he perfected the loop of the Y. There was Elena standing over him, pointing to a copy of my passport she had pulled from my bedside drawer. And there was Mr. Petrov, the notary, who was actually a disgraced former clerk from Mark's firm who had lost his license for alcohol abuse 3 years ago. "This isn't just a civil dispute anymore," Victor whispered, a grim smile touching his lips. "This is a criminal conspiracy, forgery, identity theft, and wire fraud. They're not just going to lose the apartment, Anya, they're going to lose everything." The closing for the sale of my apartment was scheduled for Friday at 10 a.m., right there in my living room. Elena wanted the symbolic transition of power to happen on the ground she had conquered. I arrived at 10:15. When I walked through the door, using the locksmith I'd hired and the police escort Victor had arranged, the scene was almost comical. Elena was serving tea to a confused-looking couple in their 60s, the prospective buyers. Mark was standing by the window, looking every bit the successful lawyer in a 3-piece suit. "Anya!" Elena shrieked, dropping a sugar cube. "I warned you! I'm calling the police!" "Actually, Elena, I brought them with me," I said, stepping aside to let 2 officers and Victor into the room. Mark turned white, not just pale, he turned the color of bone. He looked at the officers, then at Victor, and his hand began to shake so violently he had to shove it into his pocket. "What is the meaning of this?" Elena blustered, her voice rising to that shrill, principled pitch. "This is a private transaction. This woman is a trespasser." "Actually, Mrs. Sokolov," Victor said, his voice like rolling thunder, "the only trespassers here are you and your son. We have a court-ordered stay on this sale, a freeze on the St. Jude's Trust accounts, and a very interesting video of your son practicing his calligraphy skills." I walked over to the dining table and placed my tablet down in front of the buyers. I pressed play. The room went silent, save for the sound of Mark on the recording saying, "I think I've got the why right now, Mother. She'll never know." The prospective buyers stood up so fast their chairs scraped harshly against the floor. They didn't say a word. They just grabbed their coats and bolted out the door, leaving Elena and Mark alone in the middle of their crumbling empire. "Mark?" Elena hissed, looking at her son for the first time with something like fear. "Mark, do something. Tell them she's lying." But Mark was back in his favorite position, paralyzed, eyes cast down, his dignity finally stripped away to reveal the hollow man underneath. "The firm knows, Mark," I said, stepping closer to him. "Victor called your senior partner this morning. They don't take kindly to associates using their notary stamps and letterheads for domestic theft. I believe the word they used was disbarment." Mark's knees finally buckled, and he sat down heavily on the sofa I had paid for. "Anya, please. My mother. She said we needed the money for the firm. She said you'd understand eventually." I looked at him, and for the first time, I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no love, just a profound sense of relief. "You remember what your mother said about the milk and the cow, Mark? She was right about one thing. You can't respect a woman who gives everything for free. But you forgot the other half of that lesson. A cow that's been stolen always finds its way back to the barn. And the thief? He just gets the horns." The police didn't arrest them right then. That would come later, after the formal charges were processed. But they did escort them out. I watched from the balcony as Elena scurried to her car, her principled bun coming undone, looking like a common criminal. Mark followed her, his head down, his shoulders slumped, a man who had traded his soul for a property he couldn't even keep. The legal battle took 6 months. The deed was restored to my name, the trust was dissolved and investigated for tax evasion, and Mark's legal career ended before it truly began. He moved back into his mother's cramped 2-bedroom house, where I imagine they spend their days blaming each other for their ruin. As for me, the apartment feels different now. I had the floors sanded and refinished, removing the scuff marks of the movers. I replaced the curtains and bought new pillows, silk ones, not down. The scent of vanilla and old books has returned, but it's joined by something new, the scent of citrus and fresh beginnings. Yesterday, I stood on my balcony with a cup of coffee, watching the sunset paint the street in amber. My grandmother's pearls were back in their box, professionally cleaned and restrung. I realized then that Elena was wrong. A house doesn't need a master to be a home. It just needs a woman who knows her own worth and a lock that only she has the key to. Betrayal is a fire that either consumes you or forges you. As I looked out over the city I helped build, I knew which one I was. I wasn't the girl whose clothes were in the gutter anymore. I was the architect of my own life, and the foundation was finally solid.